Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. The U.S. Department of Housing and Development says research shows permanent supportive housing is the most intensive solution to combat homelessness. The agency has restructured the way it funds programs to favor permanent housing programs. That means groups that offer transitional housing are facing significant cuts. J.D. Gray reports.
The Shalom Community Center in Bloomington, Indiana offers many services to those in need, including housing and meals. Shalom Community Center Executive Director Forrest Gilmore says that he's seen the effectiveness of permanent housing firsthand.
Oh, it's magnificent in terms of its impact. I mean, we have a permanent supportive housing program for chronically homeless individuals, and we've seen remarkable results.
Gilmore can recall countless stories of how permanent housing has helped clients at the Shalom Community Center. At the same time, he sees how the changes in the budget may hurt transitional programs.
In some ways, this funding is life or death for many of these programs, and I can guarantee you that both Middle Way House and Amethyst House, both of the transitional housing programs in our community that were cut, have made tremendous differences for people who've needed them, both people fleeing domestic violence and those trying to achieve sobriety and overcome an addiction.
The Middle Way House is a transitional housing program for abused women. Executive Director Toby Strout says they have lost $174,000 in funding.
It feels irreplaceable right now. That's a considerable amount of money, and it supports the programming that we do. So you can put people in homes, but if they're not ready to sustain those homes over the long term, it's still a Band-Aid.
Middle Way House Community Service Coordinator Deborah Morrow says people with addiction issues and domestic violence survivors can be hit particularly hard by the closing of transitional housing.
Well, I'm sure all of us here would like to see everybody housed, but that's not the solution for everybody. Permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing serves a huge part of ending homelessness, but transitional housing works for certain populations.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm J.D. Gray.
Joining us now is Deborah Meyerson. Meyerson teaches housing policy at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So why is the federal government then trying to push for more permanent housing instead of that transitional housing?
Sure. Well, housing and urban development had really for the past few years really been trying to move from previous emphasis on transitional housing towards permanent supportive housing, because research shows that a housing first approach really helps get people in secure, stable homes while then dealing with other issues.
Can you try to maybe put that in context a little bit more for us in terms of how those cuts will impact the availability of housing?
Sure. Well, with transitional housing cuts, it means that certain populations that really depend on transitional housing, whether victims of domestic violence trying to flee abusive homes, youth who would otherwise be on the street, may have not have units available because the funding's been cut and there's no place that the funding's coming from.
We just saw a couple of local housing units in that story before you came on. What can we expect to see in other communities?
Sure. Well, there really needs to be a look at where the funding is going to come from. It's whether maybe emergency funding in the short term. Some mission statements may need to be altered so that organizations can reapply for funding and maybe get it this time. But it's a real question of where transitional housing funding is going to come from now.
And what are some of the challenges of that housing first model that focuses more on that permanent housing?
Sure. Well, Housing First has a lot going for it. It really provides people with stable housing that they need. However, the challenges are that the certain populations that don't benefit from that immediate transfer to housing, whether it's victims of domestic violence or youth on the street that need the transitional housing, they may not have that available.
Now what happens if that transitional housing disappears? Then what happens?
Well, more likely that women who are trying to flee abusers may stay in abusive situations. Youth that may need more stable transitions to independence don't have that and be on the street instead.
All right. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.